Hi guys, so now we are going to do our second to last ed puzzle ever. So let's just jump right into it. So we talked last week about the beginnings of the Vietnam War, and today we're going to talk about really getting into the Vietnam War with LBJ. So a big important term you got to know in the Vietnam War is this term domino theory, is what we always apply to the Vietnam War. And so the domino theory was the idea that if America didn't stop communism in Vietnam, that then it would be allowed to spread all over Southeast Asia. So it's just like playing dominoes. You knock one domino down, then the rest are going to fall. And so we were worried. America was worried because this is in the Cold War. The Vietnam War takes place during the Cold War, where we're worried that communism is spreading, particularly first in Vietnam. That communism will spread from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, and then that means Laos will become communist, and Cambodia will become communist, and Thailand will become communist, and all of Southeast Asia will become communist. And so that's going to spur America getting involved in the Vietnam War. Remember from our video last Friday that America is involved in the Vietnam War, starting with Eisenhower and Kennedy, who are going to send military advisors into Vietnam. And then we're going to officially put boots on the ground with LBJ and Nixon. So who are we fighting? Who is kind of the enemy in the Vietnam War? So his name is Ho Chi Minh. And so Ho Chi Minh, why Ho Chi Minh? Well, he's the communist leader of the Viet Minh, and he led the revolution in Vietnam against the French, and everybody in Vietnam wanted Ho Chi Minh to be their version of a president. But the problem was he was going to be communist, which meant all of Vietnam would become communist. So America does not want to see that happen. We do not want to see Ho Chi Minh take control of South Vietnam. So instead, America backs the South Vietnamese government. Now, why? Well, it's pretty obvious, because the South Vietnamese government was not communist. Now, the South Vietnamese government was led by a guy named Diem, who was very corrupt. Nobody liked him. He was actually, I told you last Friday, assassinated because he was so unpopular. But the point was, America was trying to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam taking it over and then making it communist. So let's get into the war. So there's got to be an incident, right? There's always an incident that gets us into war. So that's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So in 1964, northern Vietnamese gunboats supposedly, notice the word supposedly fire on American ships sitting out in the Gulf of Tonkin. And I showed you that map earlier or last week. So the Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water. I think you've heard of like the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water on the east coast of Vietnam. Right. So some northern Vietnamese gunboats supposedly fire on American ships. Well, that's an act of war, right? If the enemy is firing on our ships, putting our soldiers and sailors in harm, that's an act of war. And LBJ takes it as an act of war. Remember, in 1964, LBJ is now president because JFK was assassinated in late 1963. So LBJ goes to Congress with his Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and he basically says, here's the evidence. American sailors have been attacked. America must respond. Well, it turns out way later in the Pentagon Papers that Gulf of Tonkin incident was actually exaggerated. Possibly, I don't know where the exaggeration came from, but basically it wasn't as bad as it was played up to be. And this was the whole reason used to justify America putting soldiers on the ground, protecting the southern Vietnamese people, and fighting the northern Vietnamese people. So if that whole basis is false, then the whole war itself is going to come into question. And so that's going to lead to a lot of the anti-Vietnam War movement. So Congress authorizes what we call the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically authorized the buildup of troops in South Vietnam. And the purpose behind those troops were to specifically protect the South Vietnamese government, keep them in control, and keep them from becoming communist. Now, I want to be clear here. Congress actually does not declare Vietnam a war. If you remember our checks and balances, and this is really important, only Congress can declare war. And I know that's confusing because you think, well, wait a second, the president's in charge of the military. He is, okay? One of Trump's titles is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But that does not mean that Trump can just go to war whenever he wants to. We have checks and balances in the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution is that rule book. So Congress actually never officially declares a war in Vietnam. So sorry, we call it the Vietnam War. It's not technically a Vietnam War. But what Congress does authorize is the buildup of troops in Vietnam. All right. So what does LBJ do? LBJ does not want to look soft on communism. If you remember, Kennedy had been perceived as soft on communism with the Berlin Wall being built, the Bay of Pigs happening, and so LBJ is now president. He does not want to look soft on communism, so he's going to go at it hard. Okay, he's going to get into the Vietnam War guns ablazing, for lack of a better word. So Johnson is going to initiate a bombing campaign of northern Vietnam, and this bombing campaign is called Operation Rolling Thunder. And you can see from this picture, basically, we bombed the heck out of North Vietnam. Our American military bombed the heck out of northern Vietnam cities, and we caused extensive major damage in these cities. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths of northern Vietnamese people in this Operation Rolling Thunder. The idea was just bomb, 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 bomb. Unfortunately, what maybe Johnson didn't understand at the point is that in Vietnam, with their geography, oftentimes the northern Vietnamese would go underground. So when we bombed North Vietnam, when the soldiers went underground, when the bombing was over, they just came back out. And so we weren't actually causing as much, we were destroying a lot of stuff above ground. We were killing a lot of civilians, but we weren't actually able to, get the enemy as well as we were trying to do. So Johnson, by 1967, so remember Gulf of Tonkin was in 1964, so 3 years later, Johnson has about 500,000 Americans, troops in Vietnam. So that's half a million American men fighting the Vietnam War by 3 years later. So that's a lot of people fighting the Vietnam War. Now, a lot of folks were drafted into the Vietnam War, meaning that they were told you were going to go serve in the armed forces. Men were told you're going to go serve in the armed forces, and the Vietnam War very quickly got this nickname called the poor man's fight, because overwhelmingly the men who were drafted into the Vietnam War are what we would refer to as blue collar whites and blue collar African Americans. Now, remember we talked about this word blue collar back in our Cold War unit. A blue collar worker is a worker who tends to work with their hands. They tend to maybe get a little bit dirtier. So think like a mechanic or a plumber, or maybe somebody who works in a factory. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of those jobs. However, most of the time, blue collar workers don't have a lot of education, meaning typically a blue collar worker didn't go to college, that kind of thing. Ms. Crider is a white collar worker. I went to college. I have multiple degrees so that I can better teach you, kind of thing. Now, again, please understand, I'm not saying that white collar is better than blue collar. It's not. It's completely your preference. And I'm going to be honest with you, there are a lot of blue collar workers that make a lot more money than Ms. Crider does as a teacher. So we'll just put that out there. Anyway, so in the Vietnam War, blue collar whites and African Americans were oftentimes the ones drafted. And you might be thinking, well, why? Why wouldn't the rich people be drafted? Because they would find ways to avoid the Vietnam War. If you were wealthy, then you would have access to ways to avoid the Vietnam War. So a lot of young men avoided the Vietnam War in a couple of big ways. The number one way was a college deferment. What that means is if you could afford to go to college, then you could put off joining the draft until after you were done with college. But what would that look like? That would look like, you would go off to college and you would get a bachelor's degree, and then you would go get a master's degree, and maybe you'd get a PhD, right? You just stay in college, kind of thing. So that was one way to avoid the Vietnam War. A medical exemption was another way to avoid the Vietnam War. If you had any physical disability, or if you had diabetes, or maybe you had an eye problem, then you wouldn't be drafted. Or oftentimes you would join the military, but join by choice, and then you could do your service in a different place than being drafted. If you were poor, you probably didn't have the opportunity to go to college, right? There weren't, a lot of college scholarships and stuff like that back then. So what happened is a lot of poor Americans, both black and white, they were the ones who were drafted for the Vietnam War. So you can see from these charts, the Vietnam War, the number of troops really is going to escalate by 1968, right? I told you by 1967, we got about 500,000 troops in Vietnam. And you'll also notice that correlates with the number of soldiers killed in battle, right? So we're going to have so many troops. We've got over 14,000 soldier Americans dying in Vietnam in 1968. You can see how it goes up, and then the number starts to go down as troops are withdrawn. So that's the war starts in 1964. It's going to end 72, 73, and you can see when the peak of the war, Vietnam War, is happening, is also the same time that we're seeing the peak of soldiers dying. So the reason I show you this is because over time, the Vietnam War is going to get very unpopular. All right, a lot of folks are going to be opposed to the Vietnam War. First, these folks were part of the kind of response to McCarthyism. Remember, that was the guy who held up his red folder and said, "You're a communist, you're a communist," and it turned out nothing was in the red folder. And at the same time, in the 1960s, we were having the civil rights movement. So those folks are kind of going to join together, and we have this Vietnam War protest going on in the late 60s, early 70s. And so those protests are they're all over the news. They're very vocal. Even soldiers who returned home oftentimes would join the anti-war protest. And one way that soldiers or men who were going to be drafted would protest the wars, they would burn their draft card. Now I'll flip the slide here. The draft card was something you got in the mail when you turned 18, and basically it told you, "Hey, you're 18 now. You have till X date to basically sign up for the selective service, or based on when your birthday is, you would be drafted." Basically, there's only 366 possible birthdays out there in the year, right? And so they put them all. Think like the lottery with those little balls, and they pull a ball out. So they put all the possible birthdays in, and they pulled them out. And if your birthday was, I'll just say April 23rd, didn't matter what year, if you were, 18 years old to, say 30, your birthday was that day, then you're being drafted, kind of thing. By the way, burning a draft card is illegal. That is not okay. Now, what is not illegal but controversial is burning the American flag. And if you're like, "Whoa, I didn't know that was legal," it is. Texas v. Johnson, the Supreme Court case. Anyway, so these were forms of protest during the Vietnam War. You can see lots of people would hold signs and hold protest, not in favor of the Vietnam War. And really, by 1967-68, America is very much so opposed to the Vietnam War. You can see by these numbers, initially, only about, let's say 23% of America felt that the Vietnam War was a mistake. And by the end of it, you've got almost 60% of the countries feeling like the Vietnam War is a mistake. So over time, we see this big increase in dislike of the Vietnam War. There's lots of images that come from the Vietnam War. The hippies were a big deal during the 60s and 70s. And so a common phrase was to make love, not war, the idea. And so this is, an image that was put out there. Again, these kind of hippies offering flowers to those who were trying to enforce, the military trying to enforce things, the idea of love, not war. We kind of had two sides to the war debate. We had people who were called war hawks. And a hawk, you think about it like circles and, gets its prey. A war hawk was somebody who was in favor of the Vietnam War. And there were certainly lots of Americans who were in favor of the Vietnam War. Obviously, LBJ was a big war hawk himself. But then you had the doves, who were, and these are just types of birds. A dove represents peace. And so the dove, if you were a dove or you were described as a dove, you were against the war. You didn't think that we should be involved in the Vietnam War. So there's going to be a turning point in the Vietnam War. There's always a turning point in every war. And the turning point in the Vietnam War is called the Tet Offensive. And so the Tet Offensive takes place in 1968. And basically, the Viet Cong with the North Vietnamese army do a big surprise attack on South Vietnam. And I'll actually flip ahead and show you just kind of a picture right here. So all these little red dots are part of the Tet Offensive. So basically, there's a whole bunch of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and the Northern Vietnamese army on South Vietnam. And a lot of Americans are like, "What? Why were we surprise attacked? This is the American army. Like how in the world did the Viet Cong surprise attacking us?" And the media is going to, the media is very much so in the Vietnam War. Really, the Vietnam War is one of the first wars where the media is on the grounds with the soldiers reporting every day on the nightly news, on TV. It really is the first war ever reported on TV. And that in itself is going to lead to a lot of Americans being against the Vietnam War because they hear about it every day. They hear the death counts every day. They see the footage and they start to say, "I don't know that we need to be here." And so the media is going to cover the Viet Cong strike, the Tet Offensive, and the result that's going to come from it is Americans are going to start to believe that we're not winning this war. If America could be surprised attack out of nowhere and not see it coming, and for it to be that many attacks, like what's America doing? How are we going to win this war? Maybe we shouldn't be fighting this war, kind of thing. So after the Tet Offensive, and I should say America, the military, crushed the Tet Offensive. Like even though we were surprise attacked, we responded back really quickly and we crushed it. The point was, though, the American public started to lose faith that we'd ever actually win this war, that Vietnam was an unwinnable war. And when the American people start to lose faith in something, then you're not going to get a lot of public support. And so that's where those graphs that I showed you earlier, where the longer we were in the Vietnam War, the more people did not want to be in the Vietnam War, did not support the Vietnam War. And so you get a lot of war protest over the Vietnam War. So I showed you this picture. Remember, this is the Gulf of Tonkin. That was in 1964. And then all these little red dots represent the Tet Offensive that happened. So with all this going on and so many Americans against the Vietnam War, LBJ is up for re-election. And LBJ decides he's not going to run for re-election because he knew he wasn't going to win. LBJ is very unpopular by 1968, because remember, LBJ was trying to do two things. He was trying to cure poverty and he's trying to fight the Vietnam War. Well, you can't do both, right? Both are really, really expensive. And so there's growing protest over the Vietnam War. Even in Johnson's own Democratic Party, the Democratic Party is split between war hawks like Johnson and war doves who don't want to be a part of the Vietnam War anymore. And so that's going to open the door wide open to Nixon, who's a Republican, winning in 1968. Now, if you remember, Nixon won in 1968 with his Southern strategy. Remember, that's where he got the white Democrats to switch and become white Republicans. But one of the reasons Nixon wins in 1968, not only because he said he did the Southern strategy and said he pumped the brakes on civil rights, but everybody understood that a vote for Nixon would mean Nixon would end the Vietnam War. I mean, he pretty much said he was going to end the Vietnam War. He knew it was an unpopular war. So where we're going to pick up tomorrow is on the Nixon administration, which, shocker, Nixon does not end the Vietnam War. Nixon goes even further into the Vietnam War. So obviously that's going to create a lot of tension with Nixon. So that wraps us up with this one. And if you have any questions, please send me an email and I will help you. Otherwise, I hope you have a good day.